In 1959, researchers unearthed a skull of one of our ancestors that was pretty baffling. Not only was its head very hefty for its body size, the skull had a big ridge along the top, and its dramatic cheekbones flared out from the sides of its face. On top of that, this guy had a big jaw that housed some exceptionally large molars, larger than any other hominin. It was this mouthful of jumbo-sized chompers that earned the skull its nickname, Nutcracker Man. And the more we dug up on this archaic ape, the more questions we seemed to have about it. So we really had to take a long, hard look at some big, hard teeth to unravel at least some of the mystery. Here is the full story of our mysterious nut-cracking cousin. Let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. The first weird member of this branch of the family tree was found decades before Nutcracker Man hit the scene. The first skull in the group was described in 1938 by a famed and famously racist paleontologist, Robert Broom. And a couple decades later, Lewis and Mary Leakey found the similar but even more extreme Nutcracker Man skull, which was eventually lumped together with the first skull into a genus called Paranthropus. Broom's skull is from the species Paranthropus robustus, and Nutcracker Man is from Paranthropus boisei. They both appeared on the scene over 2 million years ago, but in different places. Robustus has only been found in southern Africa, while boisei called Eastern Africa home. They have another cousin called Paranthropus Aethiopicus, which hung out in the same region as boisei, but we don't have as much fossil evidence of that one, so it doesn't get as much attention. There are a few features that we know unite all the Paranthropus species together in their weird group. They each sport a big sagittal crest, which is the ridge that runs along the top of the skull. They also all have huge flared zygomatic arches, meaning really big cheekbones. These two areas of the skull are where the chewing and chomping related muscles called the masseter and temporalis muscles attach. And theirs were far beefier than ours. Let me show you. Put your fingers on your temples like this, and then clench your teeth a few times. If you feel those muscles, that's the temporalis at work. It connects from the side of your head down into your jaw. Feel along with your fingers as you clench to the side of your face, and now you're on the masseter. Working together, these muscles pull your jaw up and back with force enough to chew. Because these muscles touch so many areas of the skull, the size and shape of the bones can reveal a lot about a particular specimen's facial muscles, even when the muscles themselves are long gone. The bigger the muscle attachment zones, the stronger the maximum bite force would be. Which brings us to Paranthropus and its signature mohawk. Not only did Paranthropus have chewing muscles that went all the way to the top of the skull, they needed this ridge of bone to anchor them, which means they had massive jaw muscles. On top of a muscly face, these Paranthropus skulls had robust jaws that held some gigantic molars. P. boisei's teeth were especially dramatic, not only in their giant size, but also in how thick the enamel was. Boisei first earned the nickname Nutcracker Man after the classic Christmas decor because, well, look at it. But it wasn't just a superficial comparison. Researchers initially thought that these guys must have eaten hard foods like nuts, using their oversized and extremely strong molars, combined with all that muscle power to crack hard shells. That said, their diet has been puzzled over for quite some time, since not everyone was sold on this dietary direction. The cracks really began to appear in this nut crunching hypothesis once researchers took a deep dive into the surface damage on their teeth, which can indicate what texture of foods were eaten. For example, you'd expect to see pits in their enamel if they spent a lot of time crunching down on hard objects, like in a nut-based diet. Researchers didn't just want to look at tooth texture, though. They also analyzed the stable isotopes in the tooth enamel. Isotopes are essentially different forms of the same chemical element. The isotopes in our food and the food of our food get incorporated into our own bodies, making their way into our tooth enamel during childhood. And this can reveal a lot about diet. Grasses use a type of photosynthesis called C4, and woody plants like trees and shrubs use a different pathway called C3. Each pathway has a specific isotope signature. Since nuts grow on trees, you'd expect a species that ate a lot of trail mix to have a strong C3 signature. But after a deeper dive into Nutcracker Man's mouth, the results ended up, well, not particularly nutty. Instead of pits, they found long parallel grooves in the teeth of P. boisei, indicating that they chewed softer plant matter and not hard stuff like nuts and seeds. Not only that, but their tooth enamel showed that the majority of their plant-based diet was made up of C4 plants, meaning they appeared to spend most of their time browsing on grasses and reeds. More puzzling still, they uncovered some significant dietary differences between P. boisei and P. robustus. Robustus had a lot more of the C3 isotope signature, which meant that they likely dined on a wider range of vegetables and weren't so focused on grass grazing. They also found differences in their dental damage. Tooth chipping was really only showing up in robustus. This provided more evidence that they likely had a little more diversity in their diet than boisei, including harder foods. So robustus really did eat crunchy stuff like seeds, nuts, and roots, at least some of the time. So even though boisei had bigger molars than robustus, they didn't appear to use them to chew down on hard foods, which means we're still left with a lot of questions about what they ate. Some think their nutcracker setup simply allowed them to eat what's called fallback foods. Basically, they might have only needed to eat nuts when they couldn't find their favorite staples. In those situations, they needed the chewing equipment, so they were always prepared for a crack in case of emergency situation, which could be the case, but we just don't have enough evidence to back that up. But diet isn't the only mystery left to solve about this ancient ape. As bizarre as this big-toothed primate might appear, we knew it was still essentially an evolutionary cousin of ours. And even if we have a rough idea of where they fit on our family tree, it's taken a lot more work to figure out how they measured up to the rest of their contemporary cousins. We humans are in the great ape group hominini, which includes today's chimpanzees and bonobos. And despite an extreme lack of fossils from their past, we know the split from our modern ape relatives happened sometime between 9.3 million and 6.5 million years ago, thanks to DNA evidence. But the hominin family tree is really more like a bush with a lot of side branches and offshoots that didn't make it to the modern day, which means that the hominin club also includes a lot of extinct species, like those in the genus Australopithecus, as well as all the early human species in the Homo genus. And even though our Homo genus ancestors also differed a lot from Paranthropus, especially dentally, there's still a close branch off in terms of our ancestry. So as it currently stands, we're pretty sure Paranthropus also falls directly into our tribe, even if we couldn't ever share hats or dentures. We know that some species of Homo, Paranthropus, and Australopithecus were all alive and well at the same time, around 2 million years ago, which isn't all that long ago in the grand scheme of things. And while we may not have figured out complex dentistry yet at that point in history, we do know that early Homo species were already tool makers, but it's hard to know if Paranthropus also had that particular skill set too. That's largely because, even when we have found hand fossils from this time period, we've never been able to confirm exactly who those hand bones belonged to. There were some sites where both tools and Paranthropus fossils were found in close proximity, but that doesn't necessarily mean our big-toothed cousins were the ones behind the tools. So while some suspected that they were making and using tools alongside their relatives, there just wasn't enough to go on. But in 2025, literally while we were making this video, a paper came out that described foot and hand bones from a single specimen found alongside boisei teeth and skull fragments that add some new evidence pointing in the tool use direction. This discovery revealed that boisei had very strong and very human-like hands, complete with long and dexterous thumbs and fingers. And yes, a powerful and accurate grip is also associated with climbing abilities and not necessarily specific to tool use, but the accompanying foot fossils tell us these guys were likely spending much of their time with their feet firmly planted on the ground. So if they weren't using their strong grippers for climbing, the next best option would be tool making, right? Well, maybe. See, we know gorillas use their strong hands to break and tear the outer layers of tough plants to get juicy interior, so this could be why boisei needed strong hands too. So perhaps the diet that gave them tough teeth also went hand in hand with well, tough hands. Which brings us to some of the other lingering questions about Paranthropus. Like, researchers have been pretty divided on who's really who in this genus and how each of them should be split. When it comes to figuring out who's who in the fossil record, it can be really hard to tell whether a bunch of fossils all belong to the same species or multiple. And with something like Paranthropus, where skulls can look really different from one another, that question gets even more spicy. This is a lot trickier than you might think, thanks to something called sexual dimorphism. dimorphism, where the males and females of a species look different from one another. In some species, like gorillas, this can be a massive size difference. Now, assuming that a fossil ancestor of ours is a bit dimorphic isn't that far-fetched, because sexual dimorphism is definitely common in a lot of apes, living and long gone. Sexes often differ most dramatically in their size, with males typically having a larger body size overall. Males typically also have bigger teeth and have noticeably large canines. In a species with canine size dimorphism, one look at the canines is usually all you need to tell what sex the individual was. This dimorphism isn't a hard and fast rule for all apes, though, and we're a great example of that, since humans lost some of that dimorphism over millions of years. Trouble is, we don't know when that trend kicked off, so there's no way to know if Paranthropus would have been like us or more like other apes. Plus, it's not always easy to tell whether your fossil was a Fred or a Frida, and to make an argument about sexual dimorphism, knowing what sex you're looking at is a big deal. So if we wanted to confirm that the variation within Paranthropus is truly dimorphism, we need a way to actually make a strong argument about what sex the different fossils were. And while that's a tricky task, there are ways to do it. A big one starts in the mouth. See, there's evidence that even when our ancestors lost differences in canine tooth size, the size of the root may still be dimorphic, meaning males have longer canine roots than females do. So looking at canine root size can help estimate the sex of individuals, at least when they're at the extreme ends of the scale. This even works for modern humans. But you also need a big sample size to get the most accurate estimates, and even with a lot of teeth to pull from, it's still only really helpful to infer things about the outliers, both big and small. When there's size overlap in the middle, it's much harder. Luckily, researchers are now able to use a new technique called Paleoproteomics to solve this particular puzzle by recreating the DNA of a fossil whose DNA is completely decayed. Basically, when you find a protein in a fossil, you can reverse engineer what the DNA code that made that protein was. A 2025 paper published in Science used Paleoproteomics to look in Robustus's dental enamel for something called AMELY specific peptides. This type of protein signature comes from a gene that only exists on the Y chromosome. AMELY specific peptides have a correlate on the X chromosome called, surprisingly, AMELX specific peptides. But since everybody has at least one X chromosome, finding AMELX alone can't prove that the tooth came from a female. It's always possible that there were AMELY specific peptides, but that the sample didn't pick them up for some reason. The paper found that 2 of the 4 teeth they looked at had AMELY specific peptides, meaning that they came from males. The other 2 teeth from this study didn't have any AMELY, but they did have more AMELX than the other teeth did. The researchers argue that these teeth came from females, though this conclusion isn't as rock solid as it is for the male teeth. Interestingly, the 2 male teeth were on the small side for what you might expect from that sex, and one had even previously been thought to be female based on its measurements alone. The researchers even suggest that this little male tooth is such an outlier that it could represent a new subpopulation of Robustus or even a different species. So it's kind of the perfect case study for that different sexes or different species question that we've been exploring. All that said, this study was only looking at a very small set of proteins, so it's not enough for us to go back to the drawing board on Paranthropus species. So when it comes to Nutcracker Man and the rest of Paranthropus, we now know a lot more about them than we did even just a decade or 2 ago. But the jury's still out on a lot of details of their lives. Were they capable of making tools like the early members of the genus Homo that they crossed paths with? How closely related were these Paranthrops to our past relatives and even to each other? And if not for cracking nuts, what is really up with their big old chompers? In other words, how many nuts would Nutcracker Man crack if Nutcracker Man cracked nuts? There are definitely a lot of questions still swirling around these generously jawed marvels, but now you know at least a little more about one of your oddest looking relatives.